I'm going to be teaching social psychology today. This is usually the favorite among general psychology students because it's something all of us can relate to very easily. We interact with humans every day, at least one human every day. And that's what social psychology is all about, interaction. And we think about people in terms of the individual as a social other or an individual within a group or between groups, okay? But let's start thinking about social psychology in terms of a social thought or social cognition. Now, when I taught you cognition, I taught you things like memory, language, etc. And I also focus on the social aspects of language, okay, pragmatics. Why is it we use language in a particular style, in a particular manner, in order for us to communicate effectively with other people? You don't just produce words to another human being. Okay, you use words in a certain way to express your intent in order for the other person to understand what you want to convey. So social cognition is the way in which we interpret, we decipher, and try to comprehend social events. Okay? When I see two people arguing, how do I perceive that argument? To some people, it might be a sign of conflict between the two. To another person, it could be a healthy argument. They're trying to explain something to each other. So we interpret social situations quite differently, and there are many reasons why we do that. And the reason why we interpret situations or social events differently is because we make different attributions. Okay? And causal attribution refers to a step of inferring or concluding what the cause of an observation was. Okay? When I see someone crying, I make a causal attribution. Why is she crying? Is she crying because she just broke up with a boyfriend? Is she crying because she failed her exam? Is she crying because she's happy or she's upset? There's so many attributions we could make, so many inferences or conclusions we can make out of one single behavior. So causal attributions are made to answer questions like, why did he do that? Why did she do that? Why is she looking like that or behaving like that, etc. And there are two main types of causal attributions. A situational attribution is an attribution that focuses on factors that are external to a person. Okay? And I will give you examples in a bit. A dispositional attribution would be an attribution that focuses on factors that are internal to the person. So let's say I observe a behavior. I could either make an attribution relating to the environment. He behaves like this, it's because of the way he was brought up. A dispositional attribution would be he's behaving like this because he's just cruel, or he's evil, or he's unkind. Okay, it's something internal to the person, rather than blaming an external factor or environment. So examples of causal attributions, in terms of situational attributions, we have people's expectations. Okay, so one question or one situation that I raised to my students last semester was giving up the seat for an old person on public transportation. This was something that was very interesting to me and very refreshing to me when I came to Taiwan. Having spent a lot of time in the UK, in the US, and other countries, this was the first time in Taiwan that I saw young people very often getting up to give their seat to an older person. Now, I know it's a cultural expectation. People tell me, well, you just do it. It's part of the Taiwanese culture. You see an old person come on the bus, you see at least one young person will stand up. If a young person doesn't stand up, the bus driver might say something. And this was actually very funny to my students when I told them that I usually take a bus to work every day because I live in a place called Muzha. And there have been several times, not just once, when an old person comes on the bus, no one in front. Usually the front of the bus is for kind of older people, right? And no one stood up to give a seat to the bus. And there was a young lady sitting right at the front. And I don't know if she did not want to give up her seat or she was not paying attention. And the bus driver started giving her a lecture on the microphone. So the whole bus could hear it. So he started saying, I'm very disappointed in you. 就是我对你很失望 because I asked you to give up a seat, but you still refuse to give up your seat. Can you explain to me why? So he spent the next 15 minutes scolding her and giving her a lecture, saying that why are you not doing something that would mean a lot to this old lady. Now the problem is she's not Taiwanese. And I could sense that she's actually a foreign maid. So she had no idea what he was saying anyway. And she didn't really know the cultural expectation here. So when she got up to help another old person, I realized she's actually a domestic servant, either Filipino or Indonesian. But the fact is, she did not understand him. So he wasted the whole 15 minutes saying things that she could not understand. So situational, you can see this situational attributions very, very easily there. Okay? People who give up their seats. Now, you could say you give up your seat because you're kind. Dispositional attribution. You could say you give up your seat because it's part of your culture, that you always help the senior citizens or older people. A situational attribution. Other situational attributions are like presence of rewards or punishments. Okay, so there's an incentive. The weather, that's another situational attribution. Dispositional attribution would be, well, either you're just not good enough, you're not bright enough, or etc., etc. Okay? Other qualities of the situation, the environment, are examples of situational attributions. Dispositional attributions, commonly, you refer to someone's personality, someone's traits, someone's preferences, okay? And other personal qualities, which we will talk about a bit more later. Now, of course, causal attributions are very often determined by the culture that you live in. Not necessarily the culture you are born in, but also the culture that you live in, because you might have been raised in one culture, but then you spend many years in another culture, and you begin to follow the norms of the culture that you have embraced. Okay? Either you move to a new country, or like myself, I moved to Taiwan to work, etc. And people have strong biases in the way they interpret the behaviors of others. Biases that can sometimes lead them to overrule the evidence. Okay? There might be a behavior that's actually caused by a situational attribution, but we have certain biases because we think people from this population tend to behave this way. Okay? So we have a bias that this is more of a personal or internal attribution than a causal situational attribution. And the reason why we have stereotypes and biases is because of culture. Okay? However, not everyone in different cultures have biases, as you will be able to appreciate. Now, there are two major categories of cultures, and if you've done sociology or anything similar to that, you might have already known these concepts. Individualistic cultures and collectivist cultures. Okay? Now, individualistic cultures aim to cater to the rights, needs, and preferences of the individual. So the focus of values in individualistic cultures is the individual, as you can see in the name. And in individualistic cultures, people view themselves as fundamentally independent. Okay? People tend to see themselves as their own being rather than in relation to others. Or I'm part of this community, I'm part of this society. And in individualistic cultures, there's a belief that people behave according to their internal thoughts. So there are more internal attributions made in individualistic cultures than causal attributions. Okay? And the emphasis is on the ways a person can stand out through achieving private goals. Okay, so the value strongly encourages people to fulfill their own goals, to fulfill their own needs, rather than to fulfill the needs of the community, the needs of the society, the needs of the culture. And in these cultures, we override social obligations in order to pursue their own paths. So it's actually easier and more easily accepted if you break social norms to fulfill your own goals in individualistic cultures. So examples of individualistic cultures are countries like United States, Western Europe, Canada, and Australia. Okay? You can argue if you don't think the same. Collectivist cultures, on the other hand, stress the importance of maintaining the norms, standards, and traditions of families and other social groups. So it's more group-oriented, more community, culture, society-oriented. And people are considered to be interdependent, not independent. Okay? You expect people to behave by thinking about others. And that is the fundamental value in collectivist cultures. And people are considered or expected to fulfill obligations within one's family and the immediate community. And people are more likely to create personal plans, personal goals, according to the wishes and expectations of others. So one example would be, it's more common for Asian children to choose a profession, a job that the parents would like them to, than in the West. Okay, so it's common for some of you, perhaps, to choose a subject that your parents would prefer, not necessarily fulfilling your own goals, but fulfilling the expectations and goals of your senior family members. And there's a belief in collectivist cultures that people behave according to the demands of the situation, or the expectation of others, not necessarily to personal preferences. Now, one of the classic attribution mistakes is called the fundamental attribution error. Okay? That is when we tend to attribute behaviors to dispositional qualities or the personal internal qualities while underrating the role of the situation. So if I put it very simply, in certain situations, we blame the person, but we don't take into account why the situation made the person behave the way they did. So one very common example that was used in the US before was the torture of prisoners, okay, like the Abu Ghraib tortures. Why is it these seemingly nice boys who became soldiers, whose parents said they would never hurt another person, tortured the prisoners there? And that was a very classic example to be used when a lot of people said they must be just inherently evil, or they just have a mean bone in them, or that's just the way they were. They're aggressive by nature, and they were put in a situation that allowed them to act aggressively. On the other hand, people are also emphasizing that these soldiers were put in a very, very highly stressful situation that led them to behave the way they did. But we will go through quite a few examples of situations such as these. So one example, perhaps something that would mean more to you, is why did a driver fail to help the victim of a motorcycle accident? Okay? It's an example that would be very much valid in Taiwan, considering how many motorcyclists there are. Now, if we asked Americans or people in individualistic cultures, they might say, well, the driver was obviously irresponsible. Okay, so it's an internal or dispositional attribution, or in a state of shock. On the other hand, Hindu Indians from collectivist cultures would probably make attributions like the driver had to fulfill duties at work, and that's why he had to rush off. He couldn't stop and help. Or perhaps the victim's injury was not as serious as everyone thinks, and that's why the driver did not stop to help. So it's quite murky, the line between these two types of attributions. Okay? It's not necessarily the case that we in collectivist cultures always make statements or attributions that are so-called collectivist. Sometimes we do make dispositional attributions, especially depending on how common these kind of accidents are. Okay? Now, one reason why we might make dispositional attributions is based on our person perception. Okay? Sometimes the way a person is might make us have more tendency to blame the person for certain behavior. So the big question is, what kind of person is he or she? And there are implicit theories of personality which refer to the schemas that guide our inferences about what a person is really like and how he or she is likely to behave in the future. Okay? Now, I won't actually go through the personality traits today because I'm teaching personality in 2 weeks. Now, according to these two different cultures, there are different ways of thinking about personality. Okay? In individualistic cultures, the idea is the self, the person, is stable across time and situations. That means personality doesn't really change. Okay, the person stays true to himself or herself. And this goes beyond the information given, and we tend to make global judgments about other people's personalities. So even though there might be quite a few situational factors, people in individualistic cultures still focus on the person and not really thinking about the person in relation to the environment. For example, he or she is like this, it's because of the neighborhood. He or she is like this is because he's just aggressive or she's just aggressive. Okay? In collectivist cultures, the self is malleable, changeable, flexible. Okay? And the self changes according to relationships and situations. Relationships either within the family or outside the family. And we make more cautious and limited generalizations about other people's personalities. Again, I will focus more on personalities later on. Now, because we have these implicit theories about personality, we also have stereotypes. And stereotypes is the reason why there are so many social problems and so many failed interventions with people with problems. And stereotypes are schemas about the characteristics of whole groups. So, for example, we might have a stereotype about Greeks. We might have a stereotype about Jews. And this is particularly problematic in the US, certainly when I was in New York. There might be stereotypes about African Americans, etc. And these stereotypes lead people to talk about these groups as if we know all about them, and they are all the same. Okay, so we might, I'm trying to think of a stereotype, but I'm trying to use my own country so that I don't offend anyone. I don't know what a stereotype is about Malaysians, though. Let's say someone makes a statement that stereotypes Malaysians, saying Malaysians have confused identities. Okay, they don't know who they are, whether they're Malaysians, whether they're Chinese, whether they're Indians, whether they're Malays. Let's say, okay, I don't have that confusion. And the problem is when you make statements like this, you might be making a statement when you have not known a Malaysian at all in your life. So this is based, you're making a stereotype, you're making a stereotypical statement based on maybe what you hear, or based on the media, which is probably one of the worst sources in the world. Or you might make a stereotype about a particular group of people based on what you read, or for some reason you have developed this stereotype, or through Facebook, through the internet, etc. And group stereotypes, unfortunately, are often negative. It's very rare for us to hear a stereotype that is positive. And it is especially so when applied to minority groups. Now, because we have stereotypes, we also have prejudices. Okay? It's something that goes hand in hand, in line with a stereotype, and it's a negative attitude that a person might have towards another person based on his group membership. Okay, either I have a prejudice against a student because he or she is German, or I have a prejudice against another student because he or she is gay or lesbian. Okay? And these are very, very common prejudices, ethnic and sexual orientation, or those based on sexual orientation. And it can lead to extreme cruelties and injustice, which I don't have to tell you about because we see it all the time. Now, there are different components of prejudice. You need to understand prejudice in terms of the ABC's components. Okay? The affective component is the feeling towards that person, the feeling that comes with the prejudice. We feel prejudice towards a group or a person because we have a feeling that that group is bad for whatever reason, okay? Whether or not there's evidence. The behavioral component it refers to our tendencies to discriminate against other groups. That means we actually show behaviors that really shows our prejudice towards that group. Either in school or in university, one example would be simply not making friends, refusing to have anything to do with a person that one might have a prejudice against, either because of race or because of sexual orientation. So avoidance, that is one form of behavior. You could be, some show aggression, some become more aggressive verbally, calling names. It's very common for people with prejudices to call a certain ethnic group, a certain racial group, a particular nickname. Okay, could be extremely offensive, but these are the different kinds of behaviors one could show in prejudice. The cognitive component is the stereotype itself. Again, going back to having this schema that there is something wrong with this group, or this group is not is bad, etc. Okay. And there are many origins of stereotypes. Why is it that we have certain stereotypes and we actually don't even think much about where our stereotypes come from? And stereotypes are transmitted explicitly in some examples. For example, Grandpa always said you could never trust a particular group. Or Grandma tells me that I shouldn't make friends with that girl because she is, etc. So it's explicit teaching by our parents, by people in our community, that we shouldn't hang out, we shouldn't interact, we shouldn't make friends with a particular group of people. And stereotypes can also be transmitted implicitly. So for example, through jokes, okay, jokes about a particular group, caricatures, drawings, cartoons, okay, or portrayals in movies, for example. There's one of the biggest stereotypes in our society, gender. We see gender stereotypes so much in movies. Stereotypes about what a man and a woman can do and cannot do. What are the stereotypes you see in the superhero films? Well, now we have more and more female superheroes, but before, you always have the man being the superhero saving the world, and the woman being the one in distress and who has to be saved. So the point is, gender stereotypes are very, very often depicted in film, in movies, in almost everything. And stereotypes are formed due to lack of exposure, really. You'll be amazed that people with the strongest stereotypes don't even have not even had any relationship with a person from that group. Compared with people who constantly interact with people in that group, they gradually learn that their stereotypes are wrong. Okay? So it's really because we don't have exposure or we haven't met someone from that group to really understand why our stereotype might be wrong. The outgroup homogeneity effect refers to a phenomenon related to stereotyping in which a member of a group, the in-group, tends to view the members of another group, the out-group, as more alike than the members of his or her own group. So one example is making a comment like, all Asians are the same. It's very common when you go overseas that they say, oh, all you Asians look the same. When I go into an elevator in the US, they'll say, oh, are you from China? I said, no. I'm from Malaysia. Oh, isn't that part of China? No. So it's really frustrating because as long as they see an Asian face, you're either from China or sometimes I get, are you from Japan? They could never guess I'm from Southeast Asia. So all Asians are alike is a very common statement that you get, especially if you go to graduate school overseas, you might see that. And it's usually made by a non-Asian. Okay? Asians do make the discrimination. that you can tell, for example, people can tell that I'm not Taiwanese, or they can tell that I'm from Southeast Asia, etc. Okay? Measuring stereotypes. Okay? There are a lot of research done on stereotypes. And you could use explicit measures or implicit measures. And explicit measures are some form of self-report. And it assesses negative stereotypes. So basically, you get people to write down, do you agree with this statement about this group of people? How much do you agree with this statement? This group is always noisier than the rest, for example. And stereotypes that are measured through explicit measures are those that are more accepted publicly. It's the ones that are common. Now, implicit measures are stereotypes that are not reported by the subject. You test them by asking them to pick some pictures or make some decisions in a task that help you detect hidden biases through facial behavior reaction times. So let me give you an example of the implicit association task. It's a very controversial experiment or task because it gets people to make a judgment between faces in terms of race, in terms of age, in terms of religion as well, and etc., etc. Okay? So effects of stereotypes really kind of extend from the ABCs of stereotypes. Okay? Stereotypes influence what we believe about another person. Stereotypes shape how we act towards the person. And stereotypes influence how the targets of our stereotypes act so that the stereotype leads the targeted group to behave in a way that confirms the stereotype. So one classic example, if we expect girls to perform, to not perform as well as boys in mathematics, then girls, because they know this stereotype against them, they're likely to have lower self-esteem and lower expectations. Many girls, their expectations match the stereotype, so they also think that I'm never going to be as good as my male classmates in, for example, physics or maths. Okay, so that's a classic way of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Okay, beliefs about how a person will act or how a group will act will actually make that action more likely. One example was Rosenthal and Jacobson, one of the earlier studies that randomly assigned children to be bloomers. So they told his teacher, I'm going to give you two groups of children. Some children are bloomers, so they're likely to do very well later on. And just by giving that label, when the teacher hasn't even tested the children herself, she had raised expectations. And this actually increased the children's test scores over the year. So just by making a teacher and the children believe that they can do well later on, they were able to do so. Okay? So just to have that stereotype or label helps. Now, a stereotype threat refers to beliefs about how a particular group will act, which actually make that action more likely for an individual member for that group. So, for example, international versus local students, English ability, gender, the one that I gave you an example just now. Now, another example that has been used is when students who thought about their race, so whether they're African American or Caucasian American, they did less well on a test of intelligence. And the threat of confirming the stereotype seems to distract the test takers. So this example was actually given in relation to the American culture. They found that African American students, because they have always been viewed as less academically competent than their peers, then they actually had less confidence about taking a test. And that belief actually distracted them from doing well. Okay? Test takers of a particular race or particular gender may fear that the stereotype to some extent is correct, just like girls thinking that I'm not going to be in the top of the class in maths or physics. And this fear may lead the test takers to lower their expectations and not try as hard because they already believe that they will never be as good as the other group. So it might undermine their performance and confirm the stereotype. Now, in relation to stereotypes, you might find it difficult to distinguish between the two. Is the other type of social cognition, attitudes. Attitudes are fairly stable, evaluative dispositions that make a person think, feel, or behave positively or negatively about some person, group, or social issue. The belief that defines our attitudes are associated with emotional feelings. Okay, when we have a positive attitude towards something, we feel a positive feeling, we feel a positive emotion, and a predisposition to act in accordance with that beliefs and feelings. So if you have a particular attitude towards your studies, towards university life, you would already have a plan or have a predisposition to act accordingly to your attitude towards university or towards your studies. And attitudes are formed based on our consideration of the facts, weighing the pros and cons. I have a good attitude towards general psychology because if I have a good attitude towards it, then I will do well. Okay, you weigh the pros and cons. If you don't care about a class like this, then it could be because you have other things to consider. Okay? And attitudes are acquired through the different types of learning that I've already taught you. Okay, classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and observational learning. So let me give you examples. An example of an attitude learned through classical conditioning is, for example, a certain brand of cigarettes might be paired with an appealing person. Okay, it's quite often when you look at advertisements with cigarettes or alcohol, there's always a very good-looking guy or a very sexy girl. So we associate the two, okay, either beauty and this particular product, and we tend to have a positive attitude perhaps towards that brand of cigarettes, either perhaps because the guy who is associated with the cigarettes is also my favorite actor or my favorite singer, etc. Operant conditioning works through parents. Okay, parents reward behavior they would like to encourage. So a common attitude you might have towards your studies, being very hardworking students, for example, might have already been learned from young through operant conditioning, because your parents have always encouraged you to work hard, and it results in a positive attitude towards certain work habits. Okay? On the other hand, you might have children who have a negative attitude towards studies. Okay? They think that it's bad to work hard in school, or it's uncool, for example, to work hard in school. Observational learning happens when we see a respected peer, someone we respect, someone we admire, endorse or support a particular attitude, and we may be led to endorse the attitude ourselves. Okay, so there are different attitudes, political, towards studies, or attitudes towards family, or attitudes towards marriage. Okay, some young women might have an attitude towards marriage. Basically, they believe that one does not need to get married. Okay, one does not need to sign the papers, or a woman does not need to get married and have children. Now, that could be influenced by the other women she is interacting with, because all her peers, the women that she respects, don't have that kind of attitude that you basically try to get married and have kids. Then she might endorse that attitude herself. Okay? Of course, attitudes do change, either through being persuaded by others, or the role of experience, or persuading ourselves, which I'm actually not going to touch on. So, being persuaded by others, for example, we may care about an issue and pay close attention to the contents of the persuasive message. So one classic example would be advertisements on TV or the media. We may have an attitude about something, but the media changes our attitudes, or an advertisement changes our attitudes towards that product. We may not care about an issue, but we get distracted. And our attitude change depends on superficial factors. For example, how the person looks, who is persuading us. So for example, I might have a particular attitude towards so for example, let me go back to the gender attitude. So I might have an attitude that all women should get married as fast as possible and have children. Okay? But I might meet a group of women who are very attractive, very accomplished, so they have very good jobs and they're beautiful and they're very confident. Now, these superficial characteristics, beautiful and confident, might persuade me to change my attitude if they think women should not get married and have children. So my attitude starts changing because as I interact more and more with these women, I start to admire them based on their physical characteristics. Now, it could be quite different if it was a different type of woman trying to persuade me to change my attitude or telling me what their attitudes are. I might also change attitudes if I have experience with a particular situation or group. And one of the classic experiments is the Roberts Cave study. And what happened in the Roberts Cave study was the researchers took boys from, I think these are kind of teenage years, from middle-class families, and they took them to a summer camp. And what they did was they created groups so that they had rivalry. They started rivaling against each other. And they found that intergroup rivalry and competition could create hostility. But if you get them to experience working on a task, working on an assignment together, then the hostility can be eliminated, as long as you give them time to spend with each other. Now, another example is, how many of you have watched Survivor, the television series? It's from the US. Okay? It's exactly very similar to the Roberts Cave study. It's a TV show. It's a reality TV show where contestants go to an island, a very remote island somewhere in the world, and they start off with 2 teams, and they start competing against each other, and then sometimes the teams merge, and then they have to work together to reach a goal, and then they break into teams again. So this is another example, real example. If you want, you can watch Survivor to see this example. Now, intergroup contact can have a powerful effect, especially if the contact is sustained over a period of time. So that means you give the person enough time to change his or her attitudes. Or it involves active cooperation. You make 2 groups work on the same goal. Also, if you provide equal status for all participants, either you give them the same amount of resources or give them the same status in the group. The next part of social psychology is social influence. Okay, I've talked about attributions, stereotypes, prejudices. Social influence is one of the most highly researched areas because we're curious, why is it people so easily follow what other people do? Okay, when there's very little evidence for it to have a positive outcome. So one classic example is, why do we behave badly because of others? Why do we follow the orders of another person when the orders go against what we believe in? So these are issues like conformity, obedience, and compliance, and I'm focusing more on the first 2. Okay? And conformity refers to changing behavior due to social pressure, or the other way around, as you can see in this picture, the one bird that decides not to conform to the pattern of the others. Now, one of the earliest examples was done by Sheriff, and he conducted, you could say this was one of probably the first study on conformity. And what Sheriff did was he used an autokinetic effect to demonstrate conformity. He basically showed a spot of light. Okay? He shone a light on a wall of a room, projected on a screen, and he asked participants to evaluate how far the light moved from one position to another. A very simple task. Okay? So the task wasn't actually clearly indicating that it was measuring conformity. It was just simply asking different people to tell the researcher how far did the light move. Now, when they asked participants to look at the light alone, they gave different answers. Okay, some say how many centimeters or how many centimeters or how many inches. When they saw the light with other people in the same room, however, their responses rarely differed from the norm that developed in their particular group. So when they started hearing what other people's answers were, they changed their answers in order to conform to the norm of the group. So even our basic perceptions of the world, okay, we might be very sure that the light moved by 5 centimeters, but we might change our answers because, well, other people are saying it's 6 centimeters. Okay? So conformity can already influence our very basic perceptions of the world. Now, Ash did a study that I'm going to show you in a film, used comparisons of line length. So very similar, but this time he didn't use a light. He asked people to judge the length of different lines. And when Confederates gave incorrect responses that contradicted what the participants knew to be true, the participant went along with the incorrect response about 30% of the time. So at the beginning, in this group, basically what Ash did was he had a group of people. And I think there were like 6 or 7. One person was the subject, okay, the research subject. The other 6 or the other 5 were actually people who was working with the researchers. So they were supposed to come up with the group norm. So they would ask the participant which line is longer, okay, perhaps. And the participant might say A, line A. But then the researcher asked the rest of the group to choose line B, even though it's so obvious it's the wrong answer. And eventually the participant said, oh, okay, it's line A. Even though the participant felt, hold on, why is everyone saying line B? But he never or she never disagreed. Okay, the person would rather conform than to go against the norm. So I'll show you the example very clearly in the film. And there was less than 1 in 4 chances that the participant would act independently and disagree with the group. Okay, the causes of conformity. One is informational influence. That is, we want to be right. Okay, the reason why we conform or not conform might be because we have this desire to be right. When people are confused about the correct answer, they are more likely to seek out other cues for how they should respond. So it leads people to listen more to what others say and more social conformity. Of course, the reverse is also true. Now, normative influence stems from our desires to be liked. We don't want to look like a fool because we're the only one giving the answer that is different from everyone else. Or we don't want to feel embarrassed. So we prefer to be normal. We prefer to be following the group norm than to be correct. Okay, just like what we saw earlier. Now, when Ash's study was altered so that the participant could write their answers instead, there was very little conformity. Okay, so depending on how you measure or how you change the medium in which you respond to a task, then you can change conformity. Now, minority influence occurs when the group's unanimity is broken by even one dissenting view, and the social conformity is greatly decreased or eliminated. So in the experiment that I showed you, if one other person gives the correct answer, he might not conform, okay, because he has one other support. And the participant might feel that he can speak up without fear or embarrassment. And variation of Ash's study provides evidence that when one confederate, so for example in that experiment, if one other person gave the correct or even different response, then the pressure to conform is lessened. Okay? Of course, how much we conform does also depend on our culture. In individualistic cultures, Ash's study participants felt greater discomfort from the contrast between their own perceptions and the perceptions of others. Okay, because individualistic cultures emphasize individual beliefs and individual perceptions, then the participants feel more discomfort. They feel tense. They feel anxiety that why is it what I believe in is different from what others believe in. Collectivist cultures, on the other hand, they're less distressed. The participants felt more comfortable with ties to the group, so they weren't so worried or they weren't so conflicted when their perception was different than the others. Now, because of conformity, we also have a problem with obedience as well. Okay? And obedience has always been discussed in terms of the person-situation debate. Do we obey because the situation makes us obey, or do we obey because we have a biological tendency or an innate tendency to obey? Now, authoritarian personalities are more likely to be highly obedient. Now, this is very interesting because it means that people who have authoritarian personalities, who like to be in control, who like to be dominant, who like to control others and make decisions for others, are also more likely to be highly obedient to another person. Okay? And these people are more submissive to people above. They're more likely to obey people more senior to them, but they are very harsh to people below them, okay, to their subordinates. And people with authoritarian personalities are more likely to have prejudice against minority groups because they think minority groups are below them. Okay? And it's a motivated social cognition that causes disobedience. People respond to threats and uncertainty by expressing beliefs that help them manage their concerns. Now, so some people are more obedient than others because they might have certain personality traits. The situation might also make people more obedient. For example, the presence of authority figures. I'm obedient because there's someone who is authority figure in the room, for example. And I'll show you one experiment that shows that. I might also be obedient if I know I'm not going to be responsible for anything. Okay, that's what diffusion of responsibility is. If I'm not going to be responsible for the outcome, then I don't care for the consequences. So I'm more likely to obey even if it's something wrong. Finally, dehumanization of the victim. If I cannot tell who the victim is, or I cannot see the victim, then I might be more likely to obey to cause harm to the victim. So let me show you Milgram's experiment. Now, this is one of the most controversial, if not the most controversial. And so this kind of study can never be done now because it would be ethically a violation, okay, a violation of ethics, and you will see why. And what Milgram did was looked at how likely people would obey morally questionable orders. And he studied the obedience of participants in giving electric shocks to another person. Now, they don't actually give the electric shocks, but people actually believe they were giving electric shocks to another person. And about 65% of Milgram's participants, both males and females, obeyed the experiment right to the end, even though they had to give an electric shock that could kill the person. Okay? The scientists here say that people carry on because they know it's a scientific experiment. So the value of science in all our societies is that it's something good. At the time, it's never something bad. They wouldn't even think of it in a bad way. And so I'm doing something for the good of science at the time. Of course, now you can't do this kind of experiments anymore. Okay? So Milgram's participants were obedient because they see another person as the one in control and responsible, and increases the psychological distance between the person's actions and the end result. Okay? And when participants only had to read the words over a microphone and record the learner's responses and not administer the shocks, 90% continue till the end, the highest level of shock. Okay? So the more distance you create between the person and the responsibility or the consequence, then they're even more likely to conform, to obey. Of course, it was a severe example of ethical violation. The participants in Milgram's study were allowed to think they were hurting another human. And some of the participants actually became extremely distressed. And you can see the guy who put his head in his hands. It was such a stressful situation for him. He felt terrible about it. And even after debriefing, so even after being explained that this was just an experiment and the learner didn't get any shocks really, many were still distraught about what they had done. Because is someone telling you that you intentionally harm another person, So they felt a lot of guilt, even though it was fake, but they felt that, how could I actually do something like that? So many of them actually felt very, very upset about themselves later on. Ideas that I've heard, I know I haven't gone to all of you. One group was talking about a phenomena that was pretty obvious today. Students who don't say a word in class because no one else is saying anything. Or students who start talking because others start talking. What do you think about that? Now, the question is it conformity or is it encouragement? If you choose to speak because other people speak, it might not be conformity. It's like you have something to say and you simply feel encouraged because other people are voicing their opinions, not because you're conforming to any form of pressure, because there's no pressure. But unless you think I'm giving you pressure. So it depends whether you perceive this as a pressure or not. The teacher asking a question. Another example was getting the authority figure in an experiment would be the smartest kid or the smartest student in class. And then asking the smartest student to give wrong answers to an in-class exam. And see to what extent do students treat someone who they think is more intelligent as an authority figure. And they would choose the wrong answers because this smart kid is smart. Now what I mentioned to them was that you have to make sure that this person, you have two types, either male, female, or someone the group likes. Because there are many people who hate the smartest kid. So they don't necessarily conform because they don't like the person, not because the person is... You don't know whether it's because the person is smartest or the person is likable or not likable. So there are many variations, manipulations you can make, but you need to make sure your conformity relationship is clear. You don't want people... You think it's conformity, but it's not. Okay? At the very least, there has to be some kind of pressure for there to be conformity. Okay. Now, another reason why conformity happens is the humanization of the victim. That is, you could make a potential victim seem not human, more like an object. For example, you could take for example, in Milgram's experiment, they couldn't see the victim. So that becomes dehumanized. You don't actually see a real person in front of you. And it reduces or eliminates any sense of guilt at harming another individual and make aggression towards the victim more likely. So the more distance you create between the person and the victim, then the less likely the person, the more likely the person will harm that victim. Now, you can also see a lot of, or you can understand conformity through understanding group dynamics. Okay? Because each person in the group has an impact on every other person in the group. You might already feel that when you're doing group discussions or when you're doing a research project, that you might have a particular opinion, but you're conforming to what others think because you are not sure about your very own decision or your very own opinion. Or it could be because perhaps the other group members in your group are all your 学长 or 学姐, and you're more likely to conform to them because of that. And the mere presence of other people could already affect a person. Okay? The effect on one's performance on the task could be evident when others are present. For example, it could be through social facilitation. You perform better in the presence of others in simple or well-practiced tasks, or you could perform worse in the presence of others when it's complex or the person is inexperienced. And the reason why presence could have an effect on performance is because when other people are present, it increases our level of bodily arousal. Okay, let's just put it this way, we're not as calm when we are with other people as when we are alone. We're calmer when we're alone, or our body is less aroused when we're alone. And so it strengthens the body's tendency to perform highly dominant or automatic responses. In a simple task, the dominant or automatic responses is usually correct. Whereas in a difficult task, it's usually incorrect. Okay? Now, this is classic in university or in schools. When you ask group members to work on a task, you sometimes see social loafing. That means some individuals tend to work less hard than others because they are working in a group. So you have some hardworking people and you have some less hardworking people. And the reason is people who have to work collectively on a task tend to make less effort, less total effort than they would had they worked alone, because they know the responsibility is shared. So individuals feel less accountable, less responsible, and therefore they are less motivated to try as hard as they can. Now this applies to some people, not all people. Okay? Some students, not all students. Some students may think that their contribution is not crucial to the group success, so they try less hard than others. But it's a phenomenon called social loafing. Now, similar to dehumanization of a victim, we also behave certain ways in the group when there's de-individuation. Okay? And this is classic. This is a classic concept that you can understand through crowd behavior. And one of the earliest theories or philosophies about this is by Le Bon, who said that crowd behavior is a kind of mass madness. Okay? So let me give you an example of a case of crowd madness. Okay? Lara Logan, this was or is a CBS reporter. She's a reporter for American news channel called CBS, and she was covering the protests in Egypt. Okay, and she was sexually assaulted in Cairo. Now this is quite interesting because it happened when the protest succeeded. Okay, it was actually a situation of celebration. They were all celebrating. But the problem is she was in a mob. Okay, it was a mob of more than 200 people who were so excited, who were so happy because it was the end of the regime. And Lara Logan wanted to interview people. Oh, how happy you are, how excited you are, or just enjoying the celebrations. But the problem was she was separated from her crew at one point while she was reporting, and she was surrounded and suffered a brutal and sustained sexual assault. So she was gang raped by a group of men in this mob, and she was also beaten, severely beaten by the mob, before being saved by a group of women who were also celebrating and Egyptian soldiers. Okay? So we don't know what happened in there, but for some reason in this massive crowd, something like that happened. Okay? People who were just celebrating the end of the regime, for some reason, a separate group came out and targeted her. The key to crowd behavior is that an individual loses awareness of himself or herself as a separate individual. When you're in a crowd, you actually have quite a different identity, or you can have a different identity compared with when you're alone. Okay? So one classic example apart from that mob is sports fans. Okay? When you're watching a football match, or a baseball game, and you're with people who support your own team, you have a very different identity compared with you being Jim, you being John or Amy. Okay? You become a Red Sox fan, or you become a Real Madrid fan, etc., etc. And de-individuation is more likely to occur when there is a high level of arousal or anonymity. So a high level of arousal is a good example for the mob, the gang rape, or the thing that happened to the reporter. Okay, so everyone is very high, mostly positive, and for some reason something like that happens. Or anonymity, when you know no one will ever find out who you are, you're also more likely to lose awareness of yourself, or to do something that would go against your personal qualities. So in crowd behavior, there might be a release of impulsive actions. People become more impulsive and more likely to do something wrong that is normally under restraint. Okay, you wouldn't expect these people to go out and rape another woman on their own. But for some reason, when they were in that situation, highly aroused in a group and in a very big crowd where no one would be able to identify them easily, then that kind of behavior is more likely. So the things that cause de-individuation would be being in a crowd or wearing a mask. Okay, simply wearing a mask, hiding your identity, or wearing a uniform and having an assigned role. So let me give you an example of the bottom two. In this study, in one experiment, what they did was they got students to wear the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK robes. This was a very I was going to say a word. I've forgotten what word that was. But this was targeting African Americans. Okay, this Klan. It was a very murderous group, or you could call it a cult. It's a cult that's very much anti-minority, anti-African American, and they got students to wear these robes and asked to deliver an electric shock to another person. And they delivered twice as much shock as those not wearing the robes. So when they were given something to cover their identity, and it's a costume or a robe that clearly signifies a negative label, they did more damage than they would have otherwise. So wearing the robe seemed to lead students to take the role or take the part that would be expected from wearing a KKK robe. Okay? Now, on the other hand, you could make it a good thing. Okay? Students who wore nurse uniforms and were asked to deliver an electric shock to another person, they delivered less shock than a group without the nurse uniforms. Okay, so it seems like when the students are wearing nurse uniforms, even though they are not nurses, but just wearing the uniform made them feel like they're supposed to be kind and caring and not harmful to others, compared with wearing the KKK robes. Okay, so wearing the uniform seemed to lead them to take the positive role of a nurse and play the part. It doesn't mean that all of us should wear nurse uniforms every day, of course. But at least it's an idea about what we could perhaps, how we could encourage people or discourage people to act positively or pro-socially. Now, a very classic case of conformity and de-individuation and crowd behavior is Stanford prison experiment. I am actually not covering the Stanford prison experiment because I believe it's even more unethical than Milgram's experiment. Okay, so it's just based on my principle not to really cover it in detail. And the aim was really to study the impact of roles on behavior, and participants were actually brought to an underground facility near Stanford University, and they were randomly assigned to play the role of either the prisoner or a guard. And eventually, actually, some of these student guards started being very aggressive to the prisoners, and the study was terminated. It was ended early because the guards almost started torturing the prisoners. Okay, they were all just acting. They were all given roles, but they took the roles too seriously, to the extent the study actually went out of control. So I'm not actually going to cover that. Okay. Now, it's very common to see a phenomenon called group polarization when politicians or cabinets have to make a decision about something. For example, make a decision about whether or not to go to war, okay, or whether or not to appeal a law or to ban something. And basically, it's a tendency for group decisions to be more extreme than the decisions that would have been made by any of the group members working on their own. And the pattern is a pattern often observed in group discussions, where attitudes of each member become more extreme as a result of the discussion. So the group might start off with many different opinions, but they start slowly moving towards one opinion, and the opinion starts to become extreme because of growing consensus towards that opinion. And it happens even in the face of contrasting arguments that might moderate their views. So one example is jury decision making. Now, I know there's no jury system in Taiwan, but in countries where there is a jury to decide a case in a trial, then you do see group polarization happening a lot. Now, usually, how are jury members picked? It actually involves a huge strategy. Both the defense and the prosecution teams usually have a role. They pick who they want on the jury so that they have a balanced attitude or balanced opinions. Okay? You have people who might support the victim or people who might support the defendant and people who might not support the defendant. But in some cases of jury decision making, for some reason, something happens in a trial where the whole jury moves towards an extreme decision, either for the death penalty. Okay, we would say the death penalty is the most extreme jury decision. Now, why is it that group polarization occurs? It's because multiple restatements of their own views might strengthen the commitment to these views. If more and more people are talking about that particular view, that particular decision, that particular opinion, then it strengthens the commitment that I really believe he should get the death penalty, for example. And in confirmation bias, people pay more attention to and more readily accept information that confirms their view. Okay? So there's a desire to conform and excel and to be at the leading edge of the group view. Now, group polarization or the extreme view is more likely, of course, if there are group members who also appear as authority figures. So if we have a jury panel where one of the jury members is the most respected by the other jury members, then you're more likely to see the opinion shifting towards the opinion of this leading jury member. Okay? Now, it also is also the case when there's risky shift, that a pattern in which a group appears to be more willing to take chances. Okay? Why is it some groups can make very drastic decisions in some cases but not in others? Especially when you compare an individual in a group and an individual on his own. He is more likely to make an extreme decision in a group than when he is on his own. Again, because of the influence of the group members, especially if they agree with his opinion. Okay? Now, some of us, when we're in groups or when we're alone, we help others. Sometimes we don't know whether we should help someone else because of the people around us. I might help someone if there is no one else around. Or I might help someone if I think everyone is expecting me to help that person. So one classic example is what I said earlier, giving up your seat for an older person. Okay? If, for example, there are a lot of old people surrounding me on the bus, I might feel more pressure to give my seat up for an older person than if everyone else is young. Then I might think, well, why don't you give up your seat? Or why don't you give up your seat? Okay? And one classic example of group influence or taking into account whether other people are around you is the case of the bystander effect. But before I talk about bystander effect, let me describe to you the case of Kitty Genovese. Kitty Genovese was a prostitute in New York, okay? And it was around 8 or 9 p.m., I believe. And she was attacked outside her apartment building, I believe, for over half an hour. Okay? So she was severely, brutally attacked. I think it was with a knife. And she was screaming and screaming and screaming for help and pain, in pain. And she was finally murdered in front of many witnesses. Okay? There were a lot of people, the moment they heard the screams, they came to their window, they looked out of the window and tried to find out what happened. And they actually witnessed the crime, but no one came to her aid. And in fact, many people took a long time to actually make the 911 call. And this was the case that really brought to attention, why is it people can just not do anything when someone is in distress? Okay? And there are many reasons for that. The first one being, the situation could be ambiguous. People don't understand what should be done. Now, it could be some people saw her screaming, but they think, oh, it's a lover's fight. They're just, she wants to break up, but the guy doesn't want to, so she's pretending to scream for help because he won't let her go. Okay, they might not see the weapon, but they might think that, well, I don't know what it is. Maybe they're fighting, or maybe there's some other reason for her screaming. And some people might not want to do anything if they don't understand the situation because they're worried it might be embarrassing for them to intervene. So let's say if Kitty and the other guy were arguing as lovers, and one of the people rushed down and start beating the guy up with a baseball bat, it would be very embarrassing because he or she misunderstood the situation. So some cases we do not help others, or there's the bystander effect, is because the situation is ambiguous. We don't know what is happening. Now, how about when the situation is not ambiguous? It's an emergency. Well, there might be a diffusion of responsibility. Okay? The reason some people in that case, Kitty Genovese case, said, well, I saw there were other neighbors watching, so I thought they would call the police. Or I thought maybe someone else would go and help. Okay? So each bystander is persuaded that someone else will respond to that emergency. I don't help because, well, I'm sure someone else will help. And it's common to see people failing to help strangers in distress, even when multiple people are aware of the emergency. And the pattern is, the larger the group, the more people there are around that emergency or that situation, the less likely people are going to help. Because there are more and more people you can pass the responsibility to. Now, one interesting difference is, if you are with people you know, it's quite different. You are even more empowered to help. Large group size with familiar people can actually encourage rather than discourage helping behavior, because you might feel uncomfortable not taking an action. Okay? And there might be some embarrassment at not helping in an emergency situation. So we all know what is morally correct. And being morally correct is influenced by culture, is influenced by the societal norm. So when you're with other people who knows that norm, then you're more likely to help, to follow the moral code than not to help. Of course, whether or not the helping costs matters. Okay? If the helping will lead to physical danger, if me helping someone is going to endanger my life, I'm less likely to help, okay? Because there are costs involved. Or time, it's going to take me 1 hour to help this person, but I need to get to work. Or effort, I will have to run here and there, I will have to run up and down just to help this person. It takes effort. And the costs vary across people. It might be something physically dangerous to one person, but it might not appear as threatening to another. I actually showed a video last semester of Wesley. But for some reason, I don't have the video here. Basically, it's a case again in New York where there was a guy who was waiting for the underground train, okay, in one of the underground stations in New York. And he had an epileptic fit. Okay? He had an epileptic fit and he fell onto the train tracks. Okay? So let me draw the train tracks. So this is the platform, and these are the train tracks. So this guy had an epileptic fit, and he fell down. Now, there was another guy, a guy called Wesley, an African American, a construction worker, who was with his 2 daughters. He saw this guy fall into the train tracks. Now, you know underground trains come very quickly, okay? And you don't know when they're arriving. Well, not the ones in New York anyway, there's no warning. He took about a few seconds and he jumped right into the tracks. And what he did was, so this is a train track. The guy fell down. This guy jumped in and he pushed this guy flat onto the tracks and he laid on top of him. And he tried to push him as much down as possible, so that the train can go over them. Because it was too late for him to try and pull the guy up. First, the guy is completely unconscious, and that guy is not small. So the strategy was he was going to push him down, and he lay on top of him, as flat as possible, and the train went over them. Both of them were safe. Now, I wouldn't do that because I know I'll die. I have no idea how I'm going to make it out there, right? But this guy, he said the reason why he helped was he's in construction, and he knows how tall the train tracks are, and he knows roughly what the gap is between the train. So he knew very well, or he could estimate better than us how high the gap would be. So he knew that, of course, there's a chance he might miss, his head might come off, and actually his life would be in danger, not the poor kid. But he made that bet, he made that gamble because he had previous knowledge. Okay, so in some situations it might not be we might not see as something where our life will be in danger because we know more about the situation. And in this case, Wesley knew more about the situation, and he took that gamble. Of course, his 2 daughters were screaming and crying. But before he jumped in, he actually asked another woman to take care of his children, and then he jumped in, and that was that. Okay, so that's an example. Now, costs are sometimes weighed against the benefits of helping, like social approval, avoidance of shame, and sexual attraction, for example. So you might help if you want social approval from the other people around you, or you don't want to look like you're a very unkind person. You want to avoid shame. If you're going on a date with a girlfriend or boyfriend, okay, so let's put ourselves in the guy's shoes, okay, and I'm taking my girlfriend out for a date. I see a cute little puppy on the ground being hurt. Now, when I'm on my own, I might not pay too much attention to the poor puppy, but because my girlfriend is next to me, and she's saying, "Oh, 好可爱哦," or something like that, or 好可怜哦. Now, are you going to help or not? Okay, because you could say, well, I'm not that attracted to the girl, but I'm just helping anyway. But people are more likely to please someone they're attracted to by helping than if they had no relationship to that person, or if they didn't feel attraction towards that person. But oftentimes, we don't know why we help people. Okay, when they asked Wesley, well, why did you throw yourself down onto the track just like that? He said, the first thing he said was, because I was confident I could save him. Was it social approval? Well, no one was expecting anyone else to jump into the tracks. To them, at the time, everyone would think it's suicidal. Okay, so there wasn't really social expectation for anyone on the platform to jump in. Was it avoidance of shame? If all of them couldn't help, would they feel ashamed, or would they feel we really couldn't do anything? Okay, so reasons are it's very hard to establish reasons why we help others, but it's easier to explain why we don't help others based on all the other factors that I've shown you. Okay?